They held him at the door. It had become routine by now, almost mundane. But for Yalek, the alien at his side, it was anything but. The pair stood under the glowing neon canopy of the Vega Spire Casino, its entrance guarded by two towering beetle-like Tarkarons. They didn't even look up when they refused the human entry. "Sorry, species restrictions. Humans aren't allowed," one of the guards droned, antennae twitching. Again? The human sighed, leaning on the railing. His name was Lieutenant Carter, an officer on leave from the Starbound Accords exploration fleet. "Well, I guess I shouldn't be surprised." Yalek tilted his head, his crest fluttering in confusion. "I don't understand. Why bar you? Your credits are good, and it's not as though you've done anything wrong." Carter chuckled. "That's because you don't know the history, Yalek." He nodded toward a nearby bench. "Simon?" "I'll tell you the story. It's a good one." Once seated, Carter leaned back, looking up at the stars shimmering beyond the casino dome. "It all started with a time alarm," he began. Yalek's eyes widened. "A time alarm? Those are serious. A violation of the temporal accords." "Exactly," Carter replied. "Turns out some poor fools thought they could manipulate time to win a war. They were desperate. I'll give them that. An alien species, the Zorathians, were locked in a war with my people ages ago. It wasn't going well for them, so they tried something drastic. They sent agents back in time to undo key moments in human history." "What moments?" Yalek asked, leaning forward. Carter opened his mouth to respond, but before he could utter a word, a paper note came sailing through the air, carried by a sudden gust of wind. It smacked him square in the face. He froze for a moment, expression hidden beneath the offending currency. Then, with an exaggerated sigh, he peeled it off and inspected it. "Doesn't look like anyone's missing it," he said, glancing around. The aliens near them seemed preoccupied, oblivious to the airborne money. He stood, tucking the note into his pocket. "What do you say we get a drink?" "My treat." Yalek's jaw hung open in disbelief. "That just fell into your hands. You act like this happens all the time." Carter shrugged. "It's not that unusual." He grinned. "Besides, I'm just glad they don't use coins on this planet. Could have hurt." Yalek shook his head in bewilderment but followed Carter as he led the way to the nearest cantina. Once seated with their drinks, Yalek's a glowing green concoction, and Carter's a frothy amber brew, the human picked up his story as if nothing strange had happened. "Right, where were we?" "Oh yeah, violent moments." "So, the Zorathians, in their infinite wisdom," Carter said, his tone darkening. "They picked pivotal battles. Wars that shaped the course of our civilization." Carter took a sip of his drink, letting Yalek's bewilderment linger. Then he leaned back, settling into the next part of the tale. "The Zorathians didn't just pick those moments randomly, you know? They had this prophecy, or maybe just some fancy mathematical predictions claiming humanity would one day destroy their empire. Naturally, they didn't like the sound of that. So, their bright idea? Mess with time. Prevent us passing the Great Filter. Wipe us out before we could become a threat." Yalek tilted his head. "Seems drastic." "Sure does. But here's the kicker: time doesn't like being messed with. Every agent they sent back landed in some violent turning point in history. And because of how they operated, arrogant, unprepared, they kept winding up on the losing side. Every single time. Then came the foreordained day. The Zorathians were braced for their empire to crumble under human might. They must have been watching every fleet, every military asset, waiting for the invasion." "But what actually happened?" Carter smirked, taking another sip. Yalek blinked. "What?" Carter's smirk widened. "The stock market crashed. Human financial genius steps in and buys up every single Zorathian share at rock-bottom prices. Overnight, the Zorathian Empire was renamed the Zorathian Corporation, a wholly owned subsidiary of some human investment group. From galactic overlords to profitable portfolio assets in one day. And you better believe it's been a very lucrative investment. Yalek sat back, slack-jawed. You bought their empire? Carter shrugged. Wasn't me, but yeah, pretty much. The Zorathians were so busy worrying about war they never saw it coming. Now, they're stuck selling luxury goods and entertainment subscriptions to half the galaxy. Their prophecy came true, just not in the way they expected. Carter dropped his empty cup in the recycling bin and stood up, continuing, but what actually mattered is what happened back in time. They made themselves look like members of the losing side. He shook his head. You can imagine how that went. Yalek's crest flattened in understanding. They were mistaken for enemies. Every single time, Carter said, voice grim. One of them was thrown into the middle of our first global war, wearing the wrong uniform. Another found themselves in a revolution and got mistaken for an assassin. The Zorathians kept trying, and the universe just kept spitting them out at the worst possible times. And humans, well, we don't take kindly to outsiders meddling in our wars. Yalek shuddered. So they were killed. Or worse, Carter said quietly. The Zorathians panicked. Every time one of their agents failed, they'd send another back to fix the problem. It only made things worse. The time loop grew so tangled, it triggered alarms in the Time Watch's sensor arrays. By the time the watch stepped in and sealed the loop, human history was intact. But the universe had learned something. Yalek tilted his head. What's that? That humans, Carter said with a wry grin, always win in the end. That can't be true, Yalek protested. Carter shrugged. I didn't say it's fair. But after the Zorathians' mess, humans got a reputation. Call it luck, call it destiny, call it whatever you want. But people started to notice. If a human gets involved, things tend to go their way, no matter how impossible the odds. And that's why you're banned from casinos? Yup. Carter stood and stretched. Casinos were the first. Then the betting halls. Now it's just common sense. No one bets against a human if they've got half a brain. Before they could leave, the clattering of tiles caught their attention. Nearby, a group of aliens sat cross-legged around a low table, playing a game that resembled dominoes combined with dice. Their laughter and chatter filled the air, but it stopped abruptly as Carter approached. Mind if I join? Carter asked casually. The group exchanged wary glances, their frills and crests fluttering nervously. Finally, one of them, a Velcrat with silvery skin, spoke. You know humans aren't allowed in the casino. This isn't much different. It's just a friendly game, Carter said with a grin. No stakes, just for fun. Reluctantly, they let him join. Yalek stood off to the side, watching as Carter settled in. He picked up the strange dice and tiles, examining them for a moment before the Velcrat explained the rules. Carter nodded, catching on quickly. They began to play. An hour later, the table was quiet. The pile of winnings in front of Carter had grown absurdly large, and the aliens stared at it in stunned silence. I think that's game, Carter said, tossing down the final tile with a smirk. The Velcrat leaned back, shaking his head. Impossible. You're not even familiar with the rules. Beginner's luck, Carter said with a shrug. The Velcrat's expression hardened. Luck doesn't last forever, human. One day, it'll run out. Carter grinned, standing and gathering his winnings. Maybe. But not today. As Carter and Yalek walked away, the Velcrat turned to his companions, muttering, I'll bet you next time we play, he doesn't win. The others recoiled, their frills rising in alarm. You fool, one hissed. Never bet against a human.